The idea today is just to go through the syllabi and today's schedule, okay? I know that probably you were able to read that already. Just want to point a few important things that you need to be aware of, okay? And after that, we go through our first lecture. My question is, were you able to get it from class? It's the first lecture. It's pretty much the same. I updated like a few videos only, so it's pretty much the same content. There's a few that you need, like another one, I can just post that later. But again, the slides are pretty much the same. Okay, as you can see, I'm the course director for the Dental Materials course. So the objectives of this course is basically to prepare you to be able to select in the clinic the best material that you have, okay, available for each situation. As you saw from my lecture in amalgam and BPO, it mixed a lot of concepts about the cavity preparations and about the properties of the material itself. So the idea of this course is basically to merge and to integrate all those aspects so you can understand why you're doing that, related from the materials perspective, okay? So the idea is, every time that you talk about dental materials, sometimes you'll be eventually a little bit, okay, I don't know when or how I'm going to use that information. So if that doesn't get completely clear, please let me know, okay? I'm sure that I can find a practical example for everything that you're discussing, okay? Remember when I had dental materials, and my first professor, the first test was something like, okay, how to spell Fahrenheit. And I know that you know how to do that, but being from Brazil is a little bit more tricky. Okay, it's a complex word for us. And the other thing that he asked is for us to know the entire periodic table. So was something that I would never use again. So it didn't make sense at the time. Okay, and it still doesn't make sense to know that. Okay, to that level. So as you saw on BPO test, it will just ask things that are important for you to know. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. It's the same idea. Okay, so if at any point it doesn't get completely clear how you're going to use that, please let me know. Raise your hand, make a question, and that's absolutely fine. Okay. The objectives you can see later, but pretty much that. As in any other course, you have the grading rates in here. 90% will be based on the final exam, okay? So that's basically 6 or 7 weeks from now. And 10% will be based on the quizzes that you're going to have on the beginning of each lecture, okay? So you're going to do that from your computer, as in other courses as well. The remediation, if you get less than 70%, you need to go through the student standing and promotion committee, okay, to allow you to do the remediation. And if you pass the remediation, you get a C grade. So everything else is pretty much the same, okay? So at some point, just go through that. If you have any questions, let me know, okay? You don't need to waste a lot of time at this point. Other thing that I want to talk about with you, you have the scheduling here. It's 2019. Okay, let's update. And you know that I got the next week, so by mistake, but that's fine. Everything else continues to be exactly the same, okay? What you need to be aware, eventually this lecture here will change, okay, because Dr. Asaf usually conducts that, and he still didn't confirm for me the dates, but I'll let you know as soon as I know. If you don't have this lecture on this specific day, on April 3rd, we are going just to switch, and that will be fine as well, okay? You're going to have all the lectures that you have planned. And another thing that I want to discuss with you is that basically the same lecture that I have in dental materials for dental amalgam is pretty similar to the one that I gave to you during the BPO. So they overlap really, really a lot, okay? We can go through that again if you will, but I would prefer to give another lecture that's a lecture about glass ionomer cement that you didn't have, and technically when you have cements in the dental materials too, we don't spend a lot of time talking about the GICs. Go ahead.
For the final, do you just want us to go back over that PowerPoint?
Yes,
okay.
absolutely.
All right.
So, again, probably some of the questions that you had on the BPO will be repeated because you have some of the concepts about the dental materials for amalgams on the BPO test as well. Okay, so we can just review that PowerPoint point and that you're going to be completely fine, okay? And if you agree with that, I would like to give like this lecture, the glass ionomer 7, that I did not last year, okay, because I was not the course director. But now I think it's a good time for that. Basically, those are the 3 restorative materials that you can use directly in the mouth. So it's the resin composites, the amalgams that are covered in here, and the, the glass ionomer, okay? So you don't need to tell me now, but if somebody disagrees with that, please just send me an email and we'll go back to the amalgam lecture. Does it sound good? Okay, so it's a democratic decision, okay? Just a suggestion. If not, if you don't want to have that lecture, I can just send, I wrote an article about 3 or 4 years ago. I can send to you and you can at least have an idea about what's that, okay? Any questions so far? No? Okay. Any question about the syllabi? Did anybody read the syllabi? No? Probably I would not either. Do that at some point, okay, so you're aware of what's going on. Have any trouble, let me know, okay? So we have an important update, again, so it's 2019, so the one that you have 2018. Okay. Everything else remains pretty much the same. So this is the updated lecture. Okay. The data materials course, it has like a kind of a special taste for me because it was basically when I was hired after my master's, I was the course director of the data materials course back in Brazil. So, and one of the times I was able to go with my granddad over there. So my granddad always said to me, oh, my dream is to go to your workplace and get to know what you like to do and what to do. So a few times I was able to see him on a private practice of one of my friends back in my hometown. But technically that was not my main work. Like I was doing that sometimes only, so my main work was to be a professor there. So one of the times I was able to travel with him. I was in another city, so about 3 hours from there. And he really enjoyed the time. Like he watched exactly this lecture, but the Portuguese version. So he was really excited because we got there. Probably he don't remember anything, but I mean, he still doesn't have Alzheimer's, but he probably is left part of the lecture. And it was really funny because over there we don't have the model that we have in here. That's only 1 hour. We have 4 hours of the same lecture. So it was a little bit more complicated, okay, for both of us, for both sides. But one thing that he really enjoyed, that he still remember, he said, hey, so when I went to your lecture, we have like a lot of ladies over there. And I said, hey, just sitting in the middle of us. And he was really happy. So he remembered that part. He doesn't probably remember that I talked a lot about it. Anyhow, going back to our purpose in here. The other environment is one of the most complex environments that you can find, okay? So think about it. We have a really complicated job because when you buy a car, do you expect the car to last forever? No, right? You do maintenance, you change your car after 5, 6 years, 10 years or whatever, okay? When you buy a television, it's the same idea, okay? But when you do a restoration in the clinic, your patient expects that to last forever, right? When you place an implant, the patient expects that to last forever. There was a really funny situation here that one of the implants went bad. The screw of the abutment failed and nobody could remove the screw. And so the decision of the oral surgery and the ped was to retrieve the implant and place another one. And the patient was super concerned about it. And they said, okay, we can try to do something like a little bit more in the middle term. So we did some adaptations of some techniques and I was able to restore the implant. And she asked me, okay, how long that's going to last? I said, I have no idea. Maybe that will fail tomorrow, maybe that will fail like in 2 or 3 years. But I really hope you die with your implant in your mouth. And what happens then? And the patient got the point, but at some time, there was somebody walking by, passing by, and he just heard like, okay, I hope you'll die with the implant. And I guys looked at it, okay, never mind. I said, okay, go back here, come back here. So the patient explained it. So The problem is that we need to do something that should last forever. And we know that not all the time will be like that. Why? Because the oral environment is really harsh. Think about a ship that sank down in the water. Okay, that will be degraded. Think about every single thing that we use. The amalgam will degrade over time, will corrode, as we saw on BPR. The glass ionomer cement and the resin composites will degrade. They are plastic. They have an organic component that's degraded. Okay, either by water, either by bacteria. That's why after like some time, the composites change their color. So even when we do like composite veneers or diastema closures, after 3 or 4 years, sometimes the shade, everything's fine, but the shade's not anymore. Why? Because through the degradation of those materials, they tend to change color. So think about it. Everything that we place inside our bodies basically comes through our mouth, right? So you have different temperatures over there. So you get an ice cream, after that you get a hot coffee. So that changes completely the way that your tooth structures and your restorations, if you have some, will expand and will shrink, okay? The same with pH, so you drink Coke, after that you drink milk or whatever, okay? So you have huge difference in pH. You have a lot of bacteria in your mouth, okay? So a patient with bad hygiene tends to have more problems with restorations than a patient with good hygiene. What else you have? You have biting forces, you have patients with parafunctional activities that will destroy basically anything that you place over there if you don't take enough care. Okay? So it's really complicated, it's really complex environment. Okay? So do you think that those patients can receive exactly the same treatment at this point? Probably not. Okay? It's not only that the patient will demand different things, but also the oral environment, the habits of the patient doesn't allow you to place a composite. Think about it, the patient has a decay on the facial surface of a lateral incisor. Do you think that she takes enough care of her oral health? Probably not, right? So if you place a composite there, it's prone to fail as well. If you place a ceramic, okay, the ceramic is still bonded there with a glass ionomer or with a composite. So it will be the same outcome, that will fail over time. So there are a lot of things that you need to do to adequate the oral environment of this patient before you can treat this patient the same way as this one, okay? Where you can see that you have like a nice oral hygiene, so you don't have basically any calculus over there, you have a nice periodontal profile, a nice periodontal health, okay? So it changes completely. The same for this patient, okay? Do you think that this patient has the same aesthetic demand as this one? Probably not. Or sometimes it has. But this is basically the patient's waiting for a miracle, right? It's easier to reborn, to born again. I'm just joking, but I need to do a lot of things to get to that situation. Okay? I always say that I have really bad jokes. I have a different sense of humor. You got it already, probably. I don't know if it's because I'm from Brazil or just because I have city jokes. Anyway, both of us. But what's the problem? The ideal material for all of those patients, they need to restore in a long term the shape, and the function of that patient. Okay? And the problem is that again, they will be exposed to slightly different environments, and they need every material needs to survive through all those challenges. Okay? That's why it's so hard, and that's why it's so complicated to define a treatment plan, like a standard treatment plan. You can create like some workflow, some sequence that you can use, but not necessarily they will work for every single patient. Okay? So you saw that before, I think on the BPR lecture, the main reasons of failures, right? Remember? So the secondary decay, the fractures are the main result, the main problems that you have when you work with restorations, okay? We have dimensional changes that are responsible for some of the problems, and only 2% are based on periodontal problems. Why? Because the materials are usually really biocompatible. Okay? So that's not exactly the hugest problem. The main problem here, if you have periodontal problem, usually is the hygiene of the patient that's not good at all. Okay? So what happens? Think about, in the same way that you have technological developments in engineering, for example, in civil construction or whatever, we have that also in the dental materials field, on the dentistry field. Think about that. Before, the best impression material was what? Alginate. Nowadays you have PVS, you have intraoral scanners. Probably soon enough you're going to have ultrasounds or CBCTs that are able to scan all the preps that we have in our mouth. So the technology is going really fast, right? Nobody never thought probably that you could 3D print a crown, and now you can. Okay, you can 3D print dentures, you can 3D print surgical guides. There are some companies in Europe that 3D print implants. So those technologies are developing really fast. So what happens over time, if you remember again about the history on the amalgam, in the beginning you have no research about it. Okay, you have no standard because everything was super new. And now everything is required to go through a series of testing. So of course, because of that, they need to create some institutes, okay? Again, you don't need to know those for the test, okay? But you need to know at least that you have some committees that they assess the properties of each material, okay? The biological properties, the mechanical properties, and the physical properties of all those materials to state that they can be used inside the mouth, in the same way that the engineering does, okay? What you need to remember, not all the technology in the world comes for good things. If you are following like the news now, is the second aircraft from Boeing that crashes because of probably the same reason, right? So not all the developments, all the technology that you build in is the best thing ever. So that's the same idea. For example, when a manufacturer releases a new material, they will try to sell you as the best material as possible, okay? But sometimes just looking at the composition of the material, you know that something is probably not going to work so well, okay? Probably you don't need to know exactly which components are those right after you enter school, but over time at least you get to understand how things work and what to expect from those materials based on their properties, okay? On their composition. So for every single restoration, for every single thing that we do, we have a lot of options, okay? Each of those materials has a completely different way, a completely different behavior inside the mouth. And that's the idea of this course, to introduce those concepts for you so you can have at least an idea how to use them and when to use them. Okay? Any questions so far? Have I made myself clear so far? Yes? So it's really a mess like that, okay? That was on purpose that I placed. Everything shifted because on the beginning it's completely messy to understand and try to create your flow, okay? So what are the main properties of each material? So you have all those properties in here, okay? There are some that are really straightforward, some that are not so much. But every time that I use a material inside the mouth, what I want to keep the health, right? I want to maintain health tissues. I want my material to be compatible with the pulp tissue and also with the periodontal tissues, okay? It was really funny because quite often I go back and forth to Michigan because I came from there, as I mentioned at some point before. So we were 3D printing some bite splints, right? So one of my friends 3D printed a bite splint for him in a resin that was not biocompatible. And I asked him, okay, so what happened? He said, I don't know, but after like 2 days using that, my mouth was like big, was huge. I said, okay, so what you did? I threw away and I printed it with a biocompatible resin and everything was fine. So sometimes you don't expect things to not to work well in the mouth. And since, at least he was doing it on his health. So he's a dentist as well. So we never have like trouble with that. But we use the same resin sometimes in the past to do surgical guides. And what means that we drilled through that resin that was not biocompatible at all. Why we did that, I don't need to explain right now, but I'm just joking. But by the time we didn't have the biocompatible ones, so we thought that was a good idea. And we didn't have any trouble so far, but maybe the implants will have some trouble over time, we don't know, okay? But That's why it's so important to have agencies that can check if everything is biocompatible or not. Okay? So that's why also it's so important to have anamnesis, the historical, the medical history of your patient, if the patient has allergies to anything, okay? What's the most common materials that you can have like any allergy reaction? If you get the first gloves with the powder, there are some people that are allergic to that. I never got to the point that I could find out if I was allergic or not, but on some times of my life, when I use like the gloves, it gives like a little bit of kind of a harsh feeling on my hands, but it's not all the time. Like from 1 year using that, I have that for like 2 weeks. So I never get to the point that I could understand if I'm allergic or not to that. But in here you don't have the powder, so I don't feel anything at all. Other problems that you can have, remember, when you're going to use composites, you're going to etch the dentine, okay? You're going to place an acid over the dentine to etch that, so you can place our bonding agent. What's the problem? That bonding agent and the acid, of course, they are not compatible with the pulp tissue, okay? And that's why you're going to see that on BPOC2 active, that you use liners and base to protect the dentine, to protect the pulp tissue from those like acid materials or from those, you can't say that they're not biocompatible, but you can say maybe they're not so biocompatible if they're placed exactly over the pulp cells, okay? So basically those are the main problems that you can have nowadays, okay? So there are not a lot. Dimensional changes, that explains a lot of the reasons why sometimes our materials fail, okay? So the main thing that changes dimensions when we work in the mouth of the patient are our composites, okay? Every composite that we have, and they're going to see that with Dr. Asaf, it will shrink, okay? Because they have a network of monomers, okay? They're spread out on that composite that you place, on that increment. And when you light here, when you place the light, they tend to get together, making like what we call cross-linking. When we do the cross-linking, they will reduce in size. So usually you have like a shrinkage that varies from 1 to 7% in volume. And that will explain why we do the restorations in the way that we do. Okay, instead of placing like a huge increment over there, you place like several smaller increments to compensate for that. Or you can do the restoration outside of the mouth and just go back inside the mouth and cement that. So it's another way that you can work, okay? So I think I had something here. So that's just an example of two different composites. That one is the one that we have in here. This one is not so new, but it's another class of material. So they did an experiment with a glass plate, so light curing to 20 seconds. That's recommended by the manufacturer. And see what happens. Theoretically, this composite here has less shrinkage than the other one. So this shrinks a lot. So over time, what happens? We develop some cracks, okay? That means that your tooth structure will crack? Not necessarily, okay? But that means that this resin here shrinks a lot more. So if it shrinks a lot more, what that means for me? That I'm a lot more prone to have gaps at the interface between my tooth and the restoration. So let's imagine that this class is a class 1, okay? This lecture hall is a class 1, remember? So we have a box. We just don't have the roofing, okay? So let's suppose that I took a lot of composite, I just placed it in here, okay? So I filled this entire classroom with composite. By the time that my light comes, what happens? It will shrink. So if shrink, two things can happen, okay? Either it will shrink and will debond from the walls, meaning that I'm going to have gaps between the walls and the tooth structure. Sorry, between the walls and my composite, okay? That I'm going to have leakage, I'm going to have bacteria penetrating through those gaps and probably secondary decay. Or if my bonding agent is so strong that it can support, it can continue to be bonded even after the shrinkage stress, what's going to happen? Probably the composite is kind of trying to pull those side walls together, okay? In the tooth structure, what that's going to happen? What we call cusp deflection. So the composite kind of pulls the walls together, okay? And the cusp tends to bend a little bit inwards. Okay? There are a lot of studies about that, and that can create sometimes micro cracks on the enamel, as we saw in here. But usually what's going to happen is like to create micro gaps that will result in a secondary decay. Okay? And that's why we do, again, the restorations in the way that we do. We have difference in thermal expansion and shrinkage, so think about an amalgam and a composite. Probably they react completely different to ice cream, right? So being a metal, the amalgam will expand and will shrink theoretically a lot more, okay? The composite will vary a lot. But look, both of them are super different from the human teeth. Okay, the ceramics are quite close, the glass ionomer is quite close, but when you go to amalgams and composites, they expand and they shrink a lot more than the tooth structure. What that means for me? That, again, let's take this as an example again. So, this lecture hall is again full of composites, okay? So you start to have expansion and shrinkage, right? In a different way. What's going to happen? If my material, if my restorative material shrinks a lot more than the tooth structure, over time I'm going to have the gaps in the same way. Okay? So that's one of the reasons also why the materials tends to fail. So you're going never to find like a unique reason why that failed, except if it breaks. Okay? But if it fails kind of by itself, it can be a conjunction of several different factors. Okay?
Wait, I'm a little confused. Is this schematic saying that human teeth expand?
It expands a little bit. Every single structure will expand and will shrink when you change the temperature, okay? The degree of expansion or shrinkage that you're going to have varies from material to material. But even the structure, anything will have a difference in shrinkage. Okay, you use a ring. When it's like super warm, it's not a little bit harder to remove because something happens that changes the dimensions. Okay, in this case, it's not only like the problem with the temperature itself, but also has to do with your circulation, your blood flow, and everything else. But every material will change their dimensions. Okay?
So is it the enamel expanding and shrinking?
The enamel and the dentin, both of them. Yeah, this is a conjunction, but we have some schematics that shows like the difference between both. But they're a little bit slow with each other.
Enamel and dentin do you think expand at the same rate?
Almost. It's quite simple. Okay. Have I made myself clear so far? Any other questions? No? For example, in the same way when you take like metal ball and a ring like that, so it goes through. When you heat them, the metal will expand, and suddenly it will not go through anymore. Okay? Until it cools down. So when it cools down, it goes back to the initial dimension, and okay. That's a pretty simple idea. What happens sometimes is over time, you have something that we call fatigue. Okay? So you have fatigues that instead of breaking or cracking something like because the force was too much, it's like when during like several repetitions of the same stress, you start to break things with a lot less stress. So let's say that I want to break like a board, okay? So, I don't know, I'm hitting that with a punch. If I do that once, I need to place a lot more force than if I try to do that 10 times. Make sense? Because over 10 times I can create like kind of micro cracks on that board until I break it. Okay? Make sense? More or less? So what happens for us with the composite or with the amalgam is basically the same idea. Over time the margins will be open. Okay? If the margins being open, they are a lot more prone to stain than if they are perfectly sealed. And that's why sometimes we have those margins over there that you can see like a little bit in a dark shade. So that's kind of a leakage or what we call percolation. So marginal percolation is basically what? You have like micro gaps due to different like situations, okay? And you have a little bit of water or fluids or saliva and bacteria getting into the restoration, into the interface between the tooth and the restoration. And when it expands back to the real dimensions, it kind of places that water back. So there's something that we call, for composites specifically, that's something that's called sorption and solubility. So because of the percolation, you have sorption of water, okay? So that resin is absorbing water, and that water, or the saliva and the bacteria, will start to degrade the material, okay? And when the water gets out of the interface, what happens? You have solubility. So that's why sometimes you have a composite that degrades and the composite pops out, but you don't have decay necessarily underneath, okay? So I had a really good friend of mine. She was, I don't remember what happened, but she called me one day and says, oh, so I had a restoration. I think I have a huge decay because my restoration popped out. It's okay, just come to the office and let's see. So when I looked at that, it was completely sound denting underneath the restoration that she had. Why? Because the adhesive interface was completely degraded, okay? The preps were, instead of being converging or being parallel, the walls were explosive. So it was not, there was no mechanical retention at all, okay? So the adhesive interface was degraded and the composite popped out. Since she had like a good hygiene habit, the decay was not formed, okay? So the interface was degraded because of the sorption and solubility, okay? And because of the percolation and everything that you discussed so far, okay? But she never had a secondary decay because of that, okay? So one thing is not exactly related to the other one, okay? Make sense? Perfect. You have the thermal conductivity. It's basically the same idea when you have a metal and you place something really warm on the metal that will expand and will conduct the heat a lot faster than a composite. So that's why sometimes when you use like a metal, we need to use like liner in the base to protect and to insulate the pulp tissue. Okay? So basically here is the same idea. Have composites as a really good insulator, the dental amalgams. Again, you don't need to know exactly the numbers, you just need to know that the amalgams, being a metal, conducts heat a lot faster. So you need to use something to insulate the dentin and the pulp tissue, okay? And you have the human enamel and the dentin here pretty close to composites, okay? The only thing that you need to know is that a metal conducts heat a lot faster and you need to protect the pulp tissue from that. What's the other problem that you can have? Remember when you are drilling like on the plastic tooth and you feel like the burn smell? If that happens on the plastic tooth, nobody cares. I mean, maybe your neighbor because you smell bad. But when that happens in the clinic, that can be a little bit more concerning, okay? There was a study that was performed on monkeys. I don't remember exactly the year, but it was a long time ago. So what they did is to take like a burr, a diamond burr, and to just go like on the dentin without any water cooling, and they were measuring the temperature inside the pulp chamber. Okay, and what happened? They realized that an increase in temperature of 5.5 degrees Celsius, okay, so 10 Fahrenheit approximately, was enough to, in some of those monkeys, to induce a irreversible pulpitis, so necrosis of the pulp tissue, okay? So that explains why we need to use water cooling, water irrigation, and brand new burrs. Because again, you saw on the BP1 course that when you use like the burr 10 times, it starts to be really hard to cut, right? It loses a lot of the cutting power. So that's why you need to use a new burr. When you go to 10 degrees Celsius or 20 Fahrenheit, basically over like 50% of the pulp tissue were necrotic. But so the threshold that we consider is like 5.5. Of course, nobody can measure. Okay, are you going to measure that with your patient? It's pretty much impossible. But there are things that you need to do to avoid that. Okay, so don't drill without water. Okay, especially if you are dealing with an amalgam. Okay, basically that's the idea. So always use water cooling, brand new burrs. Otherwise, you can have a little bit of problems. Okay. See, the sense of humor in Brazil is really different. Everybody would be laughing a lot. See, like that, I don't know why, but this always happens. Like, I tell a patient, okay, pretend that you're smile, pretend that you're happy to be here when I want to take a picture. And nobody gets happy with that. For some reason, they found that in Brazil really funny. So they just give like their best smile. And it's the time that I take the picture. So now I realize that they just need to say, okay, that makes sense in Portuguese. And for some reason, they found that really funny, and they give me exactly the same smile. So I just need to add one more sentence, and that works. But I'm thinking about my, do you have those in here, like those small like handbooks with jokes? Do they have that in here? Okay, sounds good. So I will research about it. About the electrical properties, okay, some of them you saw amalgam before, right? So underwater, a metal will corrode. So one of the things that you can have is a galvanism, okay? So the galvanic current. Probably you saw that on high school, okay? And it's really funny because you can find on Google if you please, if you research about it, that some people, for some reason, they try to chill aluminum foils with amalgam. I don't know why, don't ask me why, but people do that. And what happens is that when you touch like two metals, sometimes you can feel like electrical current because you have a difference of potential, right? Again, you saw that in high school. Again, don't ask me why people do that, but they like to. It's like when I was a kid and I kind of leak a battery, but nobody never did that. But you did that, right? You see? It's a normal thing. And actually it's a way that is the old way to see if the battery has any charge. Okay? When I was like 4 or 5 years old, my mom got really pissed with that. When I was 11, I found out on the internet that they used to do that to see if the battery was charged or not. So I had an explanation for that. 6 years later. Can always explain why I do things. So, biting on aluminum foil can be painful. Why? Okay, because you're a dumb, you should not do that. Okay? But just do it. If anybody likes to chew aluminum foil, you're fine. Okay? Keep going. Anyhow, that happens, okay? Because sometimes you have the difference of potential, and when you have like just a little bit of denting, you have like a deep cavity without any insulator, that current will go through your whole tissue, and you're going to feel that, okay? If you have a nice insulation, if you have like a really shallow cavity, that should not happen, okay? If you watch House, did anybody watch House, the TV show? There was one episode, I will not remember in which one of the seasons, that he started to try to sync the radio because he had a lot of amalgam restorations. Have you ever saw that? And he think that he was having like some buzzing on his ears because of the amalgam restorations. As there were like class 2 restorations, they are touching each other and all sorts of crazy things. Anyhow, because of the electrical properties, also have the corrosion and tarnish that we saw that before, right? So that's fine. Here just like a really quick joke. Probably you did that experiment on high school as well, or something similar to that. You have a battery, you have a light, and you have like a knob over there that closes the circuit or not. Okay. So what happens if you place a composite and in between? If you place an amalgam in between, what do you think that happens if you have the amalgam? Lights up, right? How about with composites? It does not, right? Okay, it works. Okay, the same idea. Okay, this one I think I did wrong, but I have metal copying, so for sure metal will light up. The GI, the glass ionomer, is one of the materials that you can use as a base or as a liner, so of course that will prevent any like electrical and heat source from heating too much of the dent. Desorption and solubility, as we discussed before, okay, that doesn't happen only with our restorative material, but a person who likes to drink Coke or likes to drink like orange juice all the time, it can have one thing that we call erosion. It's not exactly the case in here, but pretty much more the case in their association of factors. It will start to degrade the enamel as well, okay? So what's a decay? You had cardiology already, right? Okay, so what's a decay? A the definition of decay? As what? Okay. See? That's perfect. Yeah. Okay. So how does it start? It starts as a subsurface lesion, right? Before it cavitates? Yes? Makes sense? Okay. So why is a subsurface lesion? Because you have demineralization, as you mentioned, but you also have the saliva works as a buffer, right? So you have a remineralization process as well. Did you have something about critical pH of enamel and dentin? Yes, you remember something like that? Since the critical pH of the dentin is a lot higher than the one from the enamel, it's a lot harder to remove the enamel than the dentin, right? You remember something like that? That's why it starts to be a subsurface lesion. So the sorption and solubility will work pretty much the same idea, okay? So the acids will start to degrade we start to make the enamel more porous, okay? And they start to degrade the dentin first, okay? But if you have like an acid pH all the time, okay, below the critical pH point of the enamel, you're not going to have any more white spot lesion, but you're just going to have a hole over there. So instead of like having a subsurface lesion that cavitated, you're just going to have the cavitation by itself. Make sense? Not so much? Makes sense? Okay. So the decay, you always are going to have a remineralization process that will basically prevent that. Another thing that you have about some of those properties is the wettability of our materials. So what that means for us is how hydrophilic or hydrophobic is my surface. Why is that important? For example, on an implant surface, I want that to be as hydrophilic as possible. So the blood can be around my implant as soon as possible, and the osseointegration process can start. So look at the difference. So this implant tends to osseointegrate a lot faster than the other one. And in fact, I don't think that they have any companies in here who advertise that, but we have some companies in Brazil that they advertise that you can reopen the implant in 21 days. Okay? Which is a little bit insane because super fast. Okay? And the success rate is probably not as high, but so people will start to wait a little bit more. But they have a lot of success with 21 days, so, which is really impressive. But usually in 2 months you can get like a nice result. Okay? So that means that this surface here is a lot more hydrophobic than the other one. Or the surface tension is a lot higher on that. Makes sense? So that's why we do the acid etch. Okay, when we etch the surface, we are reducing the surface tension of the dentin and the enamel, and also make that surface more rough. So usually being more rough means that you're going to be more hydrophilic as well. Okay? That's the idea. So far so good, guys? You're still with me? Okay. And the mechanical properties, okay? I try to go through that a little bit faster. But basically, just a few concepts, okay, about mechanics. That's not an engineering course, so it's just the science that studies the forces and the effects over like different bodies or different specimens, okay? The load is the force that's applied, and the force is the reaction to that. Okay, so you have a load and you have like the force that's reaction. And the stress is basically the resulting component of everything, okay? So you have the load, you have the force, and you have the stress, that's the resulting component from that. When you apply the mechanics through over like a biological body, it's biomechanics, okay? So pretty simple concepts, okay? And forgot about that one. Any deformation that you have because you apply the force is called a strain, right? That's why you have like strain gauges, if you remember again from high school. So why is that important for us? Because we bite, right? We bite different things. So probably the material that we use on posterior tooth that bites with about 58 to 60 kilograms is a little bit different from anterior tooth that we bite with about 18 kilograms, right? So that means that we don't need a super resistant ceramic, for example, on a simple incisor. And that's why you don't need to use zirconia on anterior to it, okay? Although a lot of people does, okay? I'm not saying that you can't, I'm just saying that you don't need to, okay? Why I think that you don't need to? Because aesthetically, it's not so pleasant, it's not so nice, okay? As some other ceramics that are not so strong, but again, it still works, okay? That explains also why on the beginning of the composite restoration, nobody placed composite on posteriors. Okay? First, because those materials were not so resistant, and second, because the adhesive system were not as good as the ones that we have now. Remember that? It's pretty much the same ideas as why we do internal rounded angles. Okay? So you can see that things overlap a lot. Okay? So you just want to have like rounded angles, not to distribute the stress a little bit better. Okay, so that's, we saw that before. We have different types of stress, okay? The most common ones that you're going to have in the mouth will be tensile strength, the compressive strength. We have shear strength, you're going to see more in cross, and flexural strength, the bending stress. That's really often observed, especially like on 3 units, fixed partial bridges, okay? So on BP fix, we're going to have a lot of flexural strength. Okay. So that, do you agree with me that this looks like a bridge? So you have your pontic in the center, and you have the abutments over there. It's pretty much the same idea. Okay. If you just have the abutment here in something, and the pontic over there in something that you call like a cantilever. I have another drawing that shows that. You're going just to have basically the shear force. Okay? The shear force is basically a seesaw, right? It just like tends to slide one surface against the other one. So, exactly. So the 3-unit bridge, okay? So you have like a bending stress, a flexural strength stress. So what happens? Since I'm doing exactly this movement, okay, the top of my material, it tends to get closer, okay? So now I have a compressive strength over there. And the bottom, I'm basically pushing that away, so it's a tensile stress. Tensile not traction, okay? That sometimes is, again, is Brazilian English, so that sometimes gets weird. But you get that, right? It's a tensile force. Okay, just forgot to translate on the proper way. And when you have like a cantilever like that, you just have basically shear strength in here. But it's the same idea, but now the bottom will compress, okay, because just bending like towards the center, so the bottom will compress and the top will have like tensile force, okay? That's very likely to be on your test, okay? Something similar to that. So how those forces dissipate and how they can be decomposed. And the strength, it can be temporary, that's something that you call elastic or plastic, permanent. That's something that I did with gelatin in the past. So when you try to make a tensile force over there and it goes back to the same position, to the initial position, is a elastic deformation. And when you place too much force and it breaks, it can be a plastic or a permanent deformation, okay? Go.
In the slide, when you were talking about stress with the different teeth, so the one on the right with the 2 teeth on both sides, that one was bending. Is the
This one?
Yeah, right?
Yeah, so this is shear.
That one's shear?
Yes.
Okay.
So this one is this one.
Can you explain how, with the bending stress, there's tensile at the bottom?
Sure. So, let me find the best way. Okay, I'll try again with this example. If it's still not clear, I can take another one. Let me see if I have anything better. Okay, this works. No, I thought that this will bend, but not. So let's suppose that this is the 3-unit bridge, okay? So if I start to place a force from the top, what's going to happen? It's going to make this movement, right? Do you agree with me that the bottom is trying to go far away from the center? So that's why you have tensile force here, okay, on the bottom.
Okay.
If this part is going further away, that means that this part here, the top part, is going a little bit closer, at least on the beginning, before it breaks. Because try to do that with your hands. You're going to see that in order to do this movement, the top of your hand needs to go closer to each other,
Yeah.
right? So that's why you have compressive strength over there.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Can you do the same thing with the shear hand?
Yes. Need to think about an example. I never need to do that. Okay. But now you can take it. Now that. So for shear we have basically this. Okay. So by the time that I'm placing a force, like on the cantilever, so by the time that I'm placing my force in here, okay, this, what's going to happen? So this part is going down, right? So do you agree with me that the bottom is getting closer now to the abutment? So that's why I have compressive force in the bottom, okay? And the top is going far away from the center of the tooth. Make sense? So the top is going far away, the bottom is going closer. So I have compressive on the bottom and tensile on the top. Make sense? That became more clear? Helpful?
So the direction of a shear force, isn't it more parallel to the tooth surface itself?
What do you mean?
Kind of like I don't know, when I think of shear, it's like part of the chewing process where you like rub the tooth surfaces against each other. So
No.
rather than coming straight
Okay,
down.
that's a shear force as well, but the example is different. So in here, since we have like a connector between like my abutment and my ponte, okay, all that force is on the connector. Okay, so it's basically simulating that the force is something that doesn't have any support on the bottom. Okay, so that's why it's slightly different. But yes, you can consider that the masticatory force are also a shear force between the cusps. You can say that if you want. Okay, it's just the way the example is slightly different from what you're asking. Okay. Okay, so does anybody remember of those curves? Does anybody like those curves? No? I'm the only one who likes that? Okay, this is really easy to understand, okay? This is basically the deformation that you have, the strength, okay? This is the force that you're applying. It's really simple, right? So this curve is basically a curve that shows the force versus the strength, the stress versus the strength. So what's important on this curve? That, can you see that there is like a very flat area, like a flat part, and after that you start to have like a rounded part? So the flat part means that it's really proportional, the stress that you place and the strain that you generate. What that means for us, that up to that amount of force, all the deformation that I have in here is elastic, okay? Because as soon as I remove the force, that will go back to the initial strength, because it's proportional. Can you see that's a straight line? So do you remember what's a resilient material? Resilient is something that can stand force and go back to the same position, right? So what's a resilient person? Is a person that can be under a lot of stress, right? But still doesn't go crazy, so it go back to the initial condition, okay? So like 90% of you during dental school, right? I wish we could have like, and I would like to be part of that as well. A psychological test when you get to the dental school and when you exit the dental school. We used to have that for our faculty members back at the dental school from where I graduated from the University of São Paulo. So every single person that was hired there, they have an admission test that included a psychological evaluation. And when they are not fired, because they can't be fired, but when they retire, they do a final evaluation. Nobody never mentioned the results of that, but I think people doesn't get out in the same way that they got in. So. Anyhow, you're going to feel that probably at some time. Maybe my jokes were better before. Anyhow. So what else is important? This one, the yield strength, okay, you're going to find a lot of articles talking about the yield strength of different materials. And that's basically a point, it's like over that proportional limit, that's the difference between the transition between the elastic and the plastic deformation. So everything that's after this straight line is plastic deformation, meaning that if I remove my force in here, it will never go back to the beginning. It will never go back to zero. It will go back to somewhere in between, okay? So the yield strength is a point close to that proportional limit, okay, in which my material will go almost back to the initial condition. What that means? That I need to have like a restorative material that needs to have a really high yield strength. Why? Because during the mastigatory forces, after you remove the load, that material should go back to the initial condition, okay? It's a lot more important to have a higher yield strength than a high ultimate strength. That means when the material fractures, okay? Because if you expose the material all the way up to this force, when it goes back, it will never go back to the initial condition. That will create a gap, or create like a fatigue problem, will create a lot of issues for us, okay? So I have the proportional limit, that's the limit between elastic and plastic deformation or strength, and the yield strength, that's a beginning of the permanent strength, but really close to the proportional limit, okay? So, again, why is that important? Because I need to have like a very high yield strength other than the ultimate strength, okay? Do we have a lecture at 10, or what's going on at 10? Okay. The lecture is in here? Okay, beautiful. What? Immunology. So probably can go a little bit further, maybe 2 or 3 more minutes. When the person kicks me out, I'll get out. Okay. So this is just like a 3D simulation of the mastigatory forces that you can have and how they dissipate. So those are the contact points during like the mastigatory cycle. You saw that probably with Dr. J, that you don't bite like an alligator, right? Just like open, close. It's like you rotate a little bit, right? You saw that, right? So this shows basically, let's start again, lost myself here. So this shows basically how the contact points interact with each other, okay, a patient, in a normal patient. So you just have contact points during like a small portion of your mastigatory cycle. Okay? And that force, they're distributed through the tooth tissue and also through your bone. Okay? That's why on a periodontally compromised tooth, one of the problems, the big problems that you can have is to have a bone loss, okay? And after that, the mastigatory load gets too high for that tooth and for that amount of bone to dissipate. And you start to have periodontal problems that are aggravated because of the occlusal excesses or occlusal overloads that you might have, okay? So on those periodontal patients, for example, you can try to adjust a little bit more the occlusion, as you did with your tripodonts in the past, and give the patient, giving that tooth a little bit more of a lifespan, okay? What you have in here is the final strength of different materials, okay? So you have the porcelain, so you're going to see that on ceramic lecture, that the feldspathic ceramic is the first one that we have available for dental use, okay? It's really beautiful, but it's not super resistant. In fact, it's a lot less resistance than the dentine, the enamel, and the amalgams or composites, okay? So that's why they recommend you to do like 2 millimeters. That's the classic prep that you learned on the BP Fix now. Remember, 1.5 to 2 millimeters of reduction. So that reduction was designed for this kind of porcelain, okay? For the ones that we have currently, theoretically you could do a smaller amount, but why we don't do that in here is just because the boards will ask the conventional prep. Either even like you are never asking the lab to have a feldspathic ceramic, okay? But it's just like because of the boards now. But again, if you get into like the Facebook or Instagram, you're going to see very minimal preps, right? Probably some of you saw that before. There's a website that's called Style Italiano that they show a lot of like videos and a lot of clinical cases. There's a lot of wrong things over there as well, but there are a lot of good things and good approaches and different ones. Creative approach to the same things. And you can see like very minimal preps with sometimes 0.5, 1 millimeter reduction maximum, just because they're using a different ceramic, okay? But again, because of the boards, you need to train you for the boards. Things get a little bit more restricted, okay? And this is basically the same idea that we gave to you, so after you go through the proportional limit, you have a plastic deformation, okay? That plastic deformation will generate either compression of your material if you have a compressive strength, or if you have a tensile strength, it will elongate the material, okay? Is that straightforward so far? Okay, so I think we can stop in here for now. There are probably 5 or 10 more slides maximum. I'll not go through that now. Okay, we continue in the next session. And see you next week. Thank you. Any questions so far?